All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are reading Angela Y. Davis, Women, Race, and Class. We are on the beginning of Chapter 2, page 30. Chapter 2, The Anti-Slavery Movement and the Birth of Women's Rights. When the true history of the anti-slavery cause shall be written, women will occupy a large space in its pages, for the cause of the slave has been peculiarly women's cause. These are the words of an ex-slave, a man who became so closely associated with the 19th century women's movement that he was accused of being a, quote, woman's rights man, end quote. Frederick Douglass, the country's leading black abolitionist, was also the most prominent male advocate of women's emancipation in his times. Because of his principal support of the controversial women's movement, he was often held up to public ridicule. Most men of his era, finding their manhood impugned, would have not automatically risen to defend their masculinity. Let me read that one more time. Most men of his era, finding their manhood impugned, would have automatically risen to defend their masculinity. But Frederick Douglass assumed an admirably anti-sexist posture and proclaimed that he hardly felt demeaned by the label, quote, women's rights man. I am glad to say that I have never been ashamed to be thus designated, end quote. Douglass's attitude towards his baiters may well have been inspired by his knowledge that white women have been called, quote, nigger lovers, end quote, in an attempt to lure them out of the anti-slavery campaign. And he knew that women were indispensable within the abolitionist movement because of their numbers as well as their, quote, efficiency in pleading the cause of the slave, end quote. Why did so many women join the anti-slavery movement? Was there something special about abolitionism that attracted 19th century white women as no other reform movement had been able to do? Had these questions been posed to a leading female abolitionist such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, she might have argued that women's maternal instincts provided a natural basis for their anti-slavery sympathies. This seems, at least, to be an implication of her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, whose abolitionist appeal was answered by vast numbers of women. When Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, the 19th century cult of motherhood was in full swing. As portrayed in the press, in the new popular literature, and even in the courts of law, the perfect woman was the perfect mother. Her place was at home, never, of course, in the sphere of politics. In Stowe's novel, slaves, for the most part, are represented as sweet, loving, defenseless, if sometimes naughty children. Uncle Tom's, quote, gentle domestic heart, end quote, was, so Stowe wrote, quote, the peculiar characteristic of his race, end quote. Uncle Tom's Cabin is pervaded with assumption of both black and female inferiority. Most black people are docile and domestic, and most women are mothers and little else. As ironic as it may seem, the most popular piece of anti-slavery literature of that time perpetuated the racist ideas which justified slavery and the sexist notions which justified the exclusion of women from the political arena where the battle against slavery would be fought. The glaring contradiction between the reactionary content and the progressive appeal of Uncle Tom's Cabin was not so much a flaw in the author's individual perspective as a reflection of the contradictory nature of women's status in the 19th century. During the first decades of the century, the Industrial Revolution caused U.S. society to undergo a profound metamorphosis. In the process, the circumstances of white women's lives were radically changed. By the 1830s, many of women's traditional economic tasks were being taken over by the factory system. True, they were free from some of their old oppressive jobs. Yet the incipient industrialization of the economy was simultaneously eroding women's prestige in the home, a prestige based on their previously productive and absolutely essential domestic labor. Their social status began to deteriorate accordingly. An ideological consequence of industrial capitalism was the shaping of a more rigorous notion of female inferiority. It seemed, in fact, that the more women's domestic duties shrank under the impact of industrialization, the more rigid became the assertion that, quote, women's place is in the home, end quote. Actually, woman's place had always been in the home, but during the pre-industrial era, the economy itself had been centered in the home and its surrounding farmland. While men had tilled the land, often aided by their wives, the women had been manufacturers, producing fabric, clothing, candles, soap, and practically all the other family necessities. Women's place had indeed been in the home, but not simply because they bore and reared children or ministered to their husbands' needs. They had been productive workers within the home economy, and their labor had been no less respected than their men's. When manufacturing moved out of the home and into the factory, the ideology of womanhood began to raise the wife and mother as ideals. As workers, women had at least enjoyed economic equality, but as wives, they were destined to become appendages to their men, servants to their husbands. As mothers, they would be defined as passive vehicles for the replenishment of human life. The situation of the white housewife was full of contradictions. There was bound to be resistance. The turbulent 1830s were years of intense resistance. Nat Turner's Revolt, toward the beginning of the decade, unequivocally announced that black men and women were profoundly dissatisfied with their lot as slaves and were determined, more than ever, to resist. In 1831, the year of Nat Turner's Revolt, the organized abolitionist movement was born. The early 30s also brought, quote, turnouts, end quote, and strikes to the northeastern textile factories, operated largely by young women and children. Around the same time, more prosperous white women began to fight for the right to education and for access to careers outside their homes. Okay, I want to take a moment and just touch on two things. I think one thing I want to touch on is in these first two chapters, we've heard Uncle Tom's Cabin mentioned a multitude of times. I think one of the things that's important to point out is how social issues can be not only addressed or brought to the forefront through art. I think literature is a form of art. I think writing novels is a form of art. Writing is a form of art. It's also a form of entertainment. And so I think that one of the things I want to point out is how is the different avenues that historically have been used to shed light onto social issues. And I think that Uncle Tom's Cabin is a book that brought light to the issues of slavery and to the institution of slavery. I think that one of the things that's also important to point out about that is that even though it did shed light and bring light to it, and as Angela Davis is saying, it helped to be a catalyst for the abolitionist movement, there was also misconceptions and anti-black rhetoric that was espoused within it. And so I think one of the things that we have to be aware of when we're creating art or when we're creating entertainment that is going to try to address a social issue is taking the time to make sure that we don't perpetuate false notions or false ideologies or negative ideologies within that art or within that entertainment. And I think that when you're creating art and entertainment that is that has the goal or the objective of bringing awareness to an issue or shining light on an issue, I think that has to be the primary objective of it. That can't be a side objective of it or the third, fourth thing down the line. If somebody is creating a film or a movie or a TV show or music or painting that they want to address a social issue, they also want it to be art or they also want it to be entertainment, but they want it to address a social issue, we have to get into the place of making sure that the addressing of the social issue is the primary focus and everything else comes secondary, so that way we don't end up creating something that does just as much harm as it may do good. And so even though, of course, as Angela Davis is pointing out, Uncle Tom's Cabin did some good by shedding light on the institution of slavery and the evils of it, it also perpetuated some false conceptions and some false notions that lingered on much after the release of the novel. I think, but the main thing I want to point out is the importance of using art and using entertainment and using other outlets to raise awareness to social issues. And I think one of the other things I want to point out is, one second. Okay, we're in 1830s, the early 1800s, and I think another thing that's important to point out that I don't think is taught in history lessons enough is how much the revolt of slaves or the resistance of people who were in slavery, and then also, as we're reading here too, the resistance of specifically women in their struggle to get emancipation, how important it is to resist, how, and if you don't, sometimes the story of the abolition of slavery is told from this electoral politics, political party aspect, or even this army aspect, and it makes it seem as if it was these grandiose events that led to the abolition of slavery. And in reality, it was each slave that resisted one at a time that led to those things. And I think that's something I've sort of talked about before on one of these previous episodes. But I just want to continue to bring to the forefront the importance of resisting. Okay. White women in the North, the middle-class housewife, as well as the young, quote, mill girl, end quote, frequently invoked the metaphor of slavery as they sought to articulate their respective oppressions. Well-situated women began to denounce their unfulfilling domestic lives by defining marriage as a form of slavery. For working women, the economic oppression they suffered on the job bore a strong resemblance to slavery. When the mill women in Lowell, Massachusetts, went out on strike in 1836, they marched through the town singing, "Oh, I cannot be a slave. I will not be a slave. Oh, I'm so fond of liberty. I will not be a slave." As between women who were workers and those who came from prosperous middle-class families, the former certainly had more legitimate grounds for comparing themselves to slaves. Although they were nominally free, their working conditions and low wages were so exploitative as to automatically invite the comparison with slavery. Yet it was the women of means who invoked the analogy of slavery most literally in their effort to express the oppressive nature of marriage. During the first half of the 19th century, the idea that the age-old, established institution of marriage could be oppressive was somewhat novel. The early feminists may well have described marriage as, quote, slavery of the same sort black people suffer, primarily for the shock value of the comparison, fearing that the seriousness of their protests might otherwise be missed. They seem to have ignored, however, the fact that their identification of the two institutions also implied that slavery was really no worse than marriage. But even so, the most important implication of this comparison was that white middle-class women felt a certain affinity with black women and men for whom slavery meant whips and chains. During the 1830s, white women, both housewives and workers, were actively drawn into the abolitionist movement. While mill women contributed money from their meager wages and organized bazaars to raise further funds, the middle-class women became agitators and organizers in the anti-slavery campaign. By 1833, when the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society was born in the wake of the founding convention of the American Anti-Slavery Society, enough white women were manifesting their sympathetic attitudes toward the black people's cause to have established the basis for a bond between the two oppressed groups. The first female anti-slavery society was formed by black women in 1832 in Salem, Massachusetts. In a widely publicized event that year, a young white woman emerged as a dramatic model of female courage and anti-racist militancy. Prudence Crandall was a teacher who defied her white townspeople in Canterbury, Connecticut, by accepting a black girl into her school. Her principled and unyielding stand throughout the entire controversy symbolized the possibility of forging a powerful alliance between the established struggle for black liberation and the embryonic battle for women's rights. The parents of the white girls attending Prudence Crandall School expressed their unanimous opposition to the black pupils' presence by organizing a widely publicized boycott. But the Connecticut teacher refused to capitulate to their racist demands. Following the advice of Mrs. Charles Harris, a black woman she employed, Crandall decided to recruit more black girls and, if necessary, to operate an all-black school. A seasoned abolitionist, Mrs. Harris introduced Crandall to William Lloyd Garrison, who published announcements about the school in The Liberator, his anti-slavery journal. The Canterbury townspeople countered by passing a resolution in opposition to her plans, which proclaimed that, quote, the government of the United States, the nation, with all its institutions of right, belong to the white men who now possess them, end quote. No doubt they did mean white men quite literally, for Prudence Crandall had not only violated their code of racial segregation, she had also defied the traditional attitudes concerning the conduct of a white lady. quote, "Despite all threats, Prudence Crandall opened the school. The Negro students stood bravely by her side." And then followed one of the most heroic and most shameful episodes in American history. The storekeepers refused to sell supplies to Miss Crandall. The village doctor would not attend ailing students. The druggist refused to give medicine. On top of such fierce inhumanity, rowdies smashed the school windows, threw manure in the well, and started several fires in the building. And I want to take a moment to pause and reflect on this real quick. I think one of the things that should be brought out and should be talked about, and it's a book that's very good at illuminating this concept of this idea or these events. The book's called In Defense of Looting. But the history of white riots around black people trying to gain equity and equality in this nation. When as we're reading here in the early 1800s, a white woman is trying to educate and teach black people, and white people respond in a riot. When segregation was at one of its highest extents, when segregation was still at a high extent, but was in the process of trying to be systematically torn down by black people and by allies of black people, allies of people of color. One of the things that you notice happen is when a black person will move into a neighborhood that was white, predominantly white, there would be riots to try to get them to put them in fear, to get them to move out. When black children began to attend schools that were predominantly white, there would be riots to try to get them to be scared and to get them to not attend the school. When black people would begin to get jobs and begin to be employed in certain places, there would be white people who would riot in an effort and an attempt to get them to no longer have those jobs. And that has happened at every step. At every point that black people or people of color have taken a step closer towards equity and equality. And so I think it is very hypocritical and almost ironic in a way when you hear about white people or any people in general complaining about riots or condemning people that have partaken in riots, and people who are predominantly taking place in these riots and currently right now, after a police officer has killed somebody or after the loss of life has been, or someone's life has been lost, something that cannot be restored in any type of a way. And I think that it also shows a lack of historical understanding, because there is not a group of people in this country who, when certain social issues that they don't agree with, or when certain social events have happened that they feel is opposite of or it goes against their interest as a social group here, they riot. Even when you go back to the Boston Tea Party is something that is celebrated in this country. The Boston Tea Party was a riot. There were multiple riots that took place that led to the dissolution of the colonies and the British monarchy. There were multiple riots that took place that led to the ending of the abolition of slavery. So I just think that we have to, when people just speak wholly in condemnation of riots without any understanding of the historical context or the roots, again, this country, the things that still take place to this day in this country are things that are rooted in the past and in the origins of this country. And one of those things are riots. But here, we got a little bit more time. Let's try to keep reading. Where did this young Quaker woman find her extraordinary strength and her astonishing ability to preserve in a dangerous situation of daily siege? Probably through her bonds with the black people whose cause she so ardently defended. Her school continued to function until Connecticut authorities ordered her arrest. By the time she was arrested, Prudence Campbell had made such a mark on the epoch that even in apparent defeat, she emerged as a symbol of victory. The Canterbury, Connecticut events of 1833 erupted at the beginning of a new era. Like Nat Turner's Revolt, like the birth of Garrison's Liberator, and like the founding of the first national anti-slavery organization, these events announced the advent of an epoch of fierce social struggles. Prudence Crandall's Prudence Crandall's unswerving defense of black people's right to learn was a dramatic example, a more powerful example than ever could have been imagined for white women who were suffering the birth pangs of political consciousness. Lucidly and eloquently, her actions spoke of vast possibilities for liberation if white women en masse would join hands with their black sisters. Quote, "Let Southern oppressors tremble. Let the Northern apologists tremble. Let all the enemies of the persecuted blacks tremble. Urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." End quote. This uncompromising declaration was William Lloyd Garrison's personal statement to readers of the first issue of The Liberator. By 1833, 2 years later, this pioneering abolitionist journal had developed a significant readership, which consisted of a large group of black subscribers and an increasing number of whites. Prudence Crandall and others like her were loyal supporters of the paper, but white working women were also among those who readily agreed with Garrison's militant anti-slavery position. Indeed, once the anti-slavery movement was organized, factory women lent decisive support to the abolitionist cause. Yet the most visible white female figures in the anti-slavery campaign were women who were not compelled to work for wages. They were the wives of doctors, lawyers, judges, merchants, factory owners. In other words, women of the middle classes and the rising bourgeois. In 1833, many of these middle-class women had probably begun to realize that something had gone terribly awry in their lives. As, quote, housewives, end quote, in the new era of industrial capitalism, they had lost their economic importance in the home, and their social status as women had suffered a corresponding deterioration. In the process, however, they had acquired leisure time, which enabled them to become social reformers, active organizers of the abolitionist campaign. Abolitionism, in turn, conferred upon these women the opportunity to launch an implicit protest against their oppressive roles at home. Only 4 women were invited to attend the 1833 founding convention of the American Anti-Slavery Society. The male organizers of this Philadelphia meeting stipulated, moreover, that they were to be, quote, listeners and spectators, end quote, rather than full-fledged participants. This did not deter Lucretia Mott, one of the 4 women, from audaciously addressing the men at the convention on at least 2 occasions. At the opening session, she confidently arose from her, quote, listener and spectator seat, end quote, in the balcony and argued against the motion to postpone the gathering because of the absence of a prominent Philadelphia man. Quote, right principles are stronger than names. If our principles are right, why should we be cowards? Why should we wait for those who never have had the courage to maintain the inalienable rights of the slave? End quote. A practicing Quaker minister, Lucretia Mott undoubtedly astounded the all-male audience, for in those days, women never spoke out at public gatherings. Although the convention applauded her and moved on to its business as she suggested, at the conclusion of the meeting, neither she nor the other women were invited to sign the Declaration of Sentiments and Purposes. Whether the women's signatures were expressly disallowed or whether it simply did not occur to the male leaders that women should be asked to sign, the men were extremely short-sighted. Their sexist attitudes prevented them from grasping the vast potential of women's involvement in the anti-slavery movement. Lucretia Mott, who was not so short-sighted, organized the founding meeting of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in the immediate aftermath of the men's convention. She was destined to become a leading public figure in the anti-slavery movement, a woman who would be extensively admired for her overall courage and for her steadfastness in the face of raging racist mobs. In 1838, this frail-looking woman, dressed in the sober, starched garb of the Quakers, calmly faced the pro-slavery mob that burned down Pennsylvania Hall with the connivance of the mayor of Philadelphia. Hey, what's up? How you doing? Yeah, I'm doing all good, keeping it pushing. Okay, I'll probably be leaving in like 5 minutes. Oh, thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I see you. I didn't see your name before. Thank you, I appreciate it. Have a good day. Thank you, you too. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Had somebody pull up. I do want to knock this last little segment out. 1 second, y'all. Man, I start reading. I don't be wanting to. These 30 minutes don't be long enough for me. Okay, where was we at? Okay. Mott's commitment to abolitionism involved other dangers, for her Philadelphia home was a well-traveled Underground Railroad station, where such renowned fugitives as Henry, Box, Brown, stopped off during the northward journey. On one occasion, Lucretia Mott herself assisted a slave woman to escape in a carriage under armed guard. Like Lucretia Mott, many other white women with no previous political experience joined the abolitionist movement and literally received their baptism in fire. A pro-slavery mob burst into a meeting chaired by Maria Chapman Weston and dragged its speaker, William Lloyd Garrison, through the streets of Boston. A leader of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, Weston realized that the white mob sought to isolate and perhaps violently attack the black women in attendance, and thus insisted that each white woman leave the building with the black woman at her side. The Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society was one of the numerous women's groups that sprang up in New England immediately after Lucretia Mott founded the Philadelphia Society. If the number of women who were subsequently assaulted by racist mobs or who otherwise risked their lives could actually be determined, the figures would no doubt be astoundingly large. As they worked within the abolitionist movement, white women learned about the nature of human oppression, and in the process, also learned important lessons about their own subjugation. In asserting their right to oppose slavery, they protested, sometimes overtly, sometimes implicitly, their own exclusion from the political arena. If they did not yet know how to present their own grievances collectively, at least they could plead the cause of a people who were also oppressed. The anti-slavery movement offered women of the middle class the opportunity to prove their worth according to standards that were not tied to their role as wives and mothers. In this sense, the abolitionist campaign was a home where they could be valued for their concrete works. Indeed, their political involvement in the battle against slavery may have been as intense, as passionate, and as total as it was because they were experiencing an exciting alternative to their domestic lives. And they were resisting an oppression which bore a certain resemblance to their own. Furthermore, they learned how to challenge male supremacy within the anti-slavery movement. They discovered that sexism, which seemed unalterable inside their marriages, could be questioned and fought in the arena of political struggle. Yes, white women would be called upon to defend fiercely their rights as women in order to fight for the emancipation of black people. As Eleanor Flexner's outstanding study of the women's movement reveals, women abolitionists accumulated invaluable political experiences without which they could not have effectively organized the campaign for women's rights more than a decade later. Women developed fundraising skills, they learned how to distribute literature, how to call meetings, and some of them even became strong public speakers. Most important of all, they became efficient in the use of the petition, which would become the central tactic weapon. Most important of all, they became efficient in the use of the petition, which would become the central tactical weapon of the women's rights campaign. As they petitioned against slavery, women were compelled simultaneously to champion their own right to engage in political work. How else could they convince the government to accept the signatures of voteless women, if not by aggressively disputing the validity of their traditional exile from political activity? And, as Flexner insists, it was necessary. For the average housewife, mother, or daughter to overstep the limits of decorum, disregard... Quote, for the average housewife, mother, or daughter to overstep the limits of decorum, disregard the frowns or jeers or outright commands of her menfolk, and take her first petition and walk down an unfamiliar street, knocking on doors and asking for signatures to an unpopular plea. Not only would she be going out unattended by husband or brother, but she usually encountered hostility, if not outright abuse, for her unwomanly behavior. Okay, and then that gets us to about 30 minutes here, so let's do a little small reflection, and then we'll end this episode and get ready to start for the next one. I think one of the things that stands out to me is the intersectionality of the women who were oppressed during that time. and we're speaking specifically right now of white women, the oppression that white women were facing, and the intersectionality between the oppression that black people were facing. And then within there, the specific and unique oppression that black women were facing during this time. And I think there's a lot of things to be learned from the experiences of both the white women at this time, the black women at this, or the black people, the white women at this time and the black people at this time. I think one of the things I want to point out is historically how important the black liberation movement has been in advancing other subjugated or marginalized groups' efforts for equity and for equality. And so we see how the black liberation struggle and the abolitionist struggle was something that was such a vanguard was such a vanguard in the concept of liberation, was such a vanguard in the politics of liberation, that it also assisted women's liberation and the struggle for women's rights that would come. I think that one of the other things that's important to point out here is the crucial part that women have played in every struggle that has ever existed in this country. And so just as important as it is to note that the black liberation struggle has been the vanguard of struggles in this society, it's also important to note that women have been front and center in the black liberation struggle and have been front and center in struggles in this society as a whole as well. And so I think those are things that sometimes are often overlooked or that are not dissected and talked about deeply enough. And I think that as you go through this and you read about and you read through these passages that we read in this piece of literature, those are things that stand out heavily. I think another one of the things that stands out is how much of history is regurgitated through the perspective of men, and then just select women that are chosen at certain times to tell history through. And so I think that one of the things that I find most valuable about reading this book right now is the names of women who I've never seen in historical context before. These events that these women, specifically white women, were taking part in that I didn't know about before. I've known about John Brown, who is infamous and is talked about regularly, but I didn't know about the multiple women that we just read about in here. And so I think that all of these different pieces of literature that we're reading are about filling in puzzle pieces or filling in pieces of a puzzle. And often one of the pieces of that puzzle that goes without being filled in is the piece that women play and the piece that slavery plays in the society that we have now. So on that note, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode of Rockford Reading Daily. Please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Please follow us on Facebook, like us on Twitter, or follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube. Be on the lookout for the next episode of Rockford Reading Daily coming out tomorrow. And if you haven't listened to previous episodes, please go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. And remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to present people the opportunity to begin or further their journey on the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. We outside.